Hello, everybody. We are expecting severe weather across the entire plains today, bringing with it a mostly wind and hail threat with a small isolated tornado threat over the Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado border. Today is June 2nd, 2025, and let's dive right into the forecast. For our day one convective outlook, we have a large slight risk situated starting in the Texas Panhandle, going all the way up to southern Minnesota, with a large marginal going all the way from the Mexico to Canada border. This is expected to be mostly a wind and hail threat with a 15% wind risk situated over our slight risk area and a 5% wind risk situated across our marginal area, and pretty much the same for our hail risk with a 15% and a 5% in the same area. And then for our small tornado risk, it is fairly isolated going from our Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado border to our Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota border. And last but not least, we are expecting thunderstorms once again in Florida today with a marginal over southeastern Florida. For our day two outlook, we have a fairly elongated slight risk going from Texas to southern Wisconsin, along with a marginal extending from the Canadian border to central Texas. This is once again expected to be a mostly wind and hail threat with a 15% risk of wind spanning our slight risk area and a 5% spanning our marginal. However, our hail risk is a little different with our 15% risk of hail spanning from central Texas all the way up to the southern Kansas border, and then our 5% spanning our entire risk area. And then lastly, we have a fairly elongated tornado risk spanning all the way from the northern Texas border all the way to southern Wisconsin. For our day three outlook, we see a downtrend in the expectation for severe weather, with the largest probabilities of severe weather being in eastern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and then another isolated marginal spanning from eastern Illinois all the way up to Lake Erie and Lake Huron. And something to keep an eye out for, the SPC has actually highlighted a day 4 15% severe weather risk in northwestern Texas and the Texas Panhandle. Looking at our simulated reflectivity from the HRRR today, we see our first batch of potentially severe weather is going to occur around the early afternoon with some discrete to semi-discrete cells along the Wyoming-Nebraska border, and then up here as these storms move into a more favorable environment in front of the low. That is when they have the most potential to create severe hazards, being mostly wind and a small risk of hail. And as we move forward into the later afternoon, we see a explosion of convection along what's going to fairly quickly turn into a line out here. At first, it is going to cause a very small window for tornadoes, and then it's going to turn into a hail threat, and then it's going to turn in a almost entirely wind threat. However, as we see the boundaries created by our low back here collide with our boundary up here, we do see a area of increased spin where they collide, and that is when our tornado risk is going to maximize into the late afternoon and early evening. As we move past the evening and into the night hours, this is when we see our line really become more robust and producing that maximum wind threat, along with a bowing segment down here. However, we do see a small break in weather along the northern Kansas and southern Nebraska border, but as we'll see as we push further into the night, that is expected to change. Going further into the night, we see scattered storms bubble up along the section of our bowing segment, which kind of curves back into itself and then colliding with our line up here. So this is going to create a corridor for tornadoes actually later into the night hours. And as we push further into the night, we see that our line still persists, but questions about the intensity of this arise because as we go into the night, the ingredients will dissipate. Looking at our temperature models, this gives us a better look at where our fronts are. We can actually see a somewhat strong cold front up here, which is going to be the main cause for our higher level of forcing today in that linear mode. And then we see a weaker dry line / cold front down here associated with our other storm. Another thing we notice is a warm front here, which as we move further into the day, we can kind of see that warm temperature advect up more into our main risk area Looking at this, we notice that we see mostly high 80s to low 90s along our weather risk area today. So that is going to be one of the main drivers for instability and buoyancy in the atmosphere. Looking at our dew points, we actually see a decent moisture tongue extend up into southwestern Minnesota, and along our severe weather threat today, we see areas of lower 60s dew points in this geography that is going to be enough for storms to develop. Looking at our visual satellite, we see fairly clear skies in our risk area, and that is going to be one of the causes for destabilization today. And then this is going to be supported by our CAPE model, which we actually see a decent area of CAPE going all the way up to 3,000 along our main risk area. That is definitely going to be ample storm fuel for our storms today. And then one thing we noticed looking at our wind vectors earlier in the day, we can see that they're going to be somewhat perpendicular to our initiating boundary further west. But as we move further into the day and our cold front swoops in, we see that they're actually somewhat parallel to our cold front up here, which is going to be one of the causes for that more linear mode that we see today. Looking at our significant tornado parameter, we notice that it's actually very low today, and that is one of the reasons why we're not expecting to see a lot of tornadoes or strong tornadoes. Looking at the spin in the atmosphere, we see that there is some in Minnesota associated with that low up here, and then as we go further into the day, we see that we get a fairly decent amount of spin along our boundaries, kind of colliding in central to southern Nebraska. Looking at the lower levels, which is most associated with tornado genesis, we can see that we once again get a small bit of helicity in front of our surface low in Minnesota. And then as we move further into the day in our main risk area, we see that as our two boundaries collide once again, that's where we get some helicity along our line. Looking into the upper levels to see some of our drivers of severe weather today, we see our trough going across the northern United States, helping with storm formation up there. And then we see a short wave moving over Florida, causing severe weather down there. And then the last thing we notice is our low out here and associated short wave, causing severe weather across this area. For our long-term precipitation outlook, we are going to look at the European model, and what we see is our storms that we're expecting with this system, and then our daily afternoon storms in Florida associated with that westerly flow across the state. As we move forward, we're expected to see the severe weather persist into the week, along with our afternoon showers in Florida. And then after that system moves off, we see sort of a low develop in the central plains, bringing severe weather with it on Thursday, right in this area. And after that, that's expected to bring its own weather across the United States. And then that should move off by Sunday this week. We're expected to see another northern trough bring severe weather to the United States once again, precipitation extending from Oklahoma all the way to northern Florida. And that could be cause for severe weather all the way through Thursday next week. And then something crazy is we see yet another northern trough bring potential for severe weather. So this June is still predicted to be fairly active.